The Capital Area Muslim Bar Association and the American Bar Association co-hosted a discussion recently on recent trends in anti-Muslim bullying and ways lawyers can better advocate for students affected by bullying. They discussed ways in which students, teachers, and others involved with schools could best help Muslim students who were the victims of bullying related to their faith. After the discussion, panelists took questions from the audience. This is about an hour and 25 minutes.
Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Feel free to grab a seat. So, good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Capital Area Muslim Bar Association's program this evening, Anti-Muslim Bullying, Emerging Issues, and Pro Bono Opportunities. I'm Salima Snow. I am one of the board members of the Capital Area Muslim Bar Association. I'm also fortunate to serve as an associate professor of law at the University of the District of Columbia David A. Clark School of Law, the public interest law school for the District of Columbia, committed to eradicating social justice inequities such as the issues that we're addressing today. Before we get started, I want to thank our hosts, O'Malvany and Myers, for tonight's event. Thank you, O'Malvany. The firm has provided the space and sponsoring the reception for us. We're also honored to have the American Bar Association Section for Civil Rights and Social Justice Bully-Proof Committee joining us as a co-sponsor. Courtney Dunn, we thank you for making this co-sponsorship happen. In 2013, I believe it was, the section developed its Bully-Proof initiative as a way to do programs at schools and youth centers and bringing together students, parents, teachers, administrators, members of the community to address and collaborate on solutions to the bullying epidemic. Tonight's program is part of CAMBA's initiative to amplify our voice so that we are, in fact, working as a collaborative to identify issues that are impacting the Muslim community. We believe this collaboration with the ABA is moving us closer to fulfilling that mission. Our panel this evening consists of social justice advocates who are addressing some of the disparities in society through direct client representation, through policy work, and through systemic reform. Directly to my left is Jonathan Smith, who is the Executive Director of the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Urban Affairs. Next to Jonathan is Aisha Rahman, the Executive Director of Karamah, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. We have Suzanne Greenfield, who's Director of the Citywide Youth Bullying Prevention Program at the D.C. Office of Human Rights, and Brenda Abdelall with Muslim Advocates, where she is the director of its program to strengthen Muslim charities. So, appropriately, October is National Bully Prevention Month. It's a month to educate and to raise awareness of bullying prevention. This week is also National Pro Bono Week, and that initiative is designed to increase access to justice by recruiting volunteers who will assist in representing people who are low income and those who are often vulnerable. Tonight's program is really about addressing an issue that impacts the most vulnerable members of our community, our children and our youth. So when we're looking at Muslim children in particular, we're going to kind of focus this panel on issues impacting them as children, which I think that part of the conversation is often overlooked. And I think it's fair to say that there is an assertive campaign to create this otherness, if you will, when we talk about Muslims as foreigners, as terrorists, as extremists. And just for the record, I'm Muslim and I'm born in Boston, Massachusetts. And for those who are questioning, I do have a birth certificate to even prove that. But this image of Muslims as foreigners and terrorists helps to perpetuate that narrative, if you will, that makes it acceptable for our legislators, for our courts also, to somehow justify discriminatory practices under the umbrella of national security. So I think the first question I'd like to pose to the panel as we initiate and start this conversation is, has this prevalent anti-Muslim climate created school cultures where schools are actually able to demonstrate an indifference to harassment against Muslim students. Aisha, maybe you can start us off. What is that nexus between the rhetoric that we hear and bullying?
Sure. Thank you, Salima, for that, and thank you all for being here this evening. Unfortunately, there is a direct correlation between the rhetoric that is all too common now in our society, that is anti-Muslim, that is very xenophobic, that is otherizing American Muslims, and that is unfortunately infiltrating not only amongst adults, not only on social media, it's pervading our mass media screens, and unfortunately the most vulnerable of our population, our children, are being exposed to that rhetoric, and it's becoming almost the norm, I would say. It's very troubling for me. As Salima said, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit, Karamah, based here in DC, and we get calls from mothers and fathers on a daily basis, it seems, about how to deal with their young children being asked about very harrowing issues, anti-Muslim issues, and about what's happening overseas, and a lot of different kinds of things. And I thought I'd share a quick story to illustrate this point, and I think that this is really this really broke my heart. So I was invited to speak at a local school in Maryland, and some students came up to me afterwards, 2 young women came to me afterwards and said, you know, we're not out as Muslims at school. And I said, okay, and I asked them to tell me more. And they said, well, we just don't feel comfortable, not only amongst their peers, but also from the administration, from teachers, from the principal. They didn't feel comfortable even owning their identity as Muslim women. I think that, you know, there had been some incidents, there had been, and I'm smiling because I'm not as aware of all of the different social media platforms, but I was informed in this conversation of a certain social media platform where you can anonymously post particular to that one school, so only people who are at that school can post about that school. And so there had been some very troubling remarks about Muslims, about women on this platform, and that had made these young women, these 2 young women, hide their identity publicly, and they felt that they needed to come and to use their terms, out themselves to me so that they could talk with me about what they were going through. But I think that that's really an example, and this was not after this happened. It's happened to me multiple times where people have started to say they go by a different name in school, they wear different clothes at school, and so I think there is a direct correlation, and I can go into statistics a little bit later, of hate speech and the rhetoric that is in our public spaces, and how it's impacting Muslim identity and bullying in schools.
So, Brenda, thank you, Aisha. Brenda, I know that you're doing a lot of this work on the ground as well. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing at Muslim Advocates, if you have anything you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, and thank you again for having me here. You know, I always say that anti-Muslim bullying does not happen in a vacuum, and similar to Aisha's point, we are seeing a direct correlation between the climate of anti-Muslim policies and how that impacts school children. And more than any other time in the history of our organization, we have tracked many, many, many instances of anti-Muslim bullying. And even in instances where families where their children haven't been bullied, it is the #1 concern that we hear across the board from parents all the time. I'm a parent myself. I'm always worried that somebody's going to say something to one of my children at school. And, you know, you raise your kids to be proud of who they are. And, you know, I fear, similar to what Aisha just said, you know, that they may want to not share that part of their identity as they get older and become more aware of the rhetoric that surrounds them. But, you know, one thing that I will add to that is, you know, it happens in multiple layers. You know, there's certainly what what we call peer-to-peer bullying, which happens between a student and another student. However, we also see a significant number of instances where administrators at the school are the ones that are perpetuating the anti-Muslim climate at the school. These are relationships in which students trust their teacher. They go to their teacher when they have a problem. This is the person that they're learning from. And we have that teacher themselves perpetuating stereotypes, saying hateful comments, saying, your dad's part of the Taliban, oh, go sit down, or, these types of derogatory comments that come from teachers also play a role in that overall climate for how students feel at school. It may not come from their peers, but it may also come from the administrators. So I just wanted to add that extra layer.
So do we have any data or statistics showing whether Muslims are being disproportionately targeted when it comes to bullying? I'm looking at Suzanne, and actually Suzanne and I used to cross paths representing students with disabilities, and students with disabilities are often very vulnerable and targeted. So I'm wondering if we have any data or statistics about Muslims being disproportionately targeted. If we don't, quite honestly, why don't we have it? Does anyone know?
I mean, I can speak from the local level, and we are collecting that data. We have a law in the District of Columbia which defines bullying in a lot of specific ways. It doesn't trip off the tongue. It's not an easy definition. But a part of it is we very much want to know if the bullying is based on a particular trait. So we have covered the list of traits of 19 traits that are all covered by the D.C. Human Rights Act. So we are definitely collecting that. I've, in fact, put out the call for all of our schools to report their incidents from last year on this, and we will be reporting on it. I have to tell you, anecdotally, I have had many parents call me, not about specific incidents, but about fears. More than that, I really do feel like we've triggered our adults, if we haven't triggered our kids into this equation yet. And the district is somewhat different in terms of our population, so I'm hearing it a lot from our immigrant communities in general. Certainly our Latina community is hearing all kinds of things on the playground that wasn't said before, this last year, quite to that level. So we are hearing it anecdotally. I don't know that we have any of the numbers yet, but we have definitely triggered the adults.
So let me step outside of my normal advocacy role for a moment and work on the dark side. So why is this bullying? Why isn't it just the normal power dynamic that happens at school and the way that kids are in the playground? You talked about the identifying factors that the D.C. Human Rights Act, or not the D.C. Human Rights Act, but it is in the D.C. Human Rights Act. Yeah. So why isn't this just that, power dynamics, how kids are in the playground? How are we distinguishing the two?
I would say what's fascinating to me, and we have over 200 different school buildings here in the district. Half of our kids are in charter schools and half are in the D.C. public schools. And I would say that building by building it looks very different depending on what the demographics of that building are, depending on the leadership in that building of how they set a tone, who is welcome, how welcome they are, who's acknowledged. If we have a lot of immigrants in a building and you don't see any signage in other languages, whether it's Amharic or Spanish, or any of our other community languages, there's a real recognition of who's in that building. And I can promise you, going across the city, there are schools that are literally 2 blocks from each other that the climate and the culture looks very different in terms of who's recognized. And that's true for our kids with disabilities. It's true for our gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender kids.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Aisha.
I was just going to add to that. I think that part of why I say that it's now become the norm to have this kind of rhetoric is that I was reading an article, and many of you may have read it, by a colleague, N.G. Abdelkader. I can give you the citation later, but she was talking about how she was speaking to a group of young Muslim women and asked a question, have you ever been bullied? And nobody really responded. And then she said, well, have any of you been called a terrorist? And almost every hand went up. And it's a very troubling, I use that anecdote or that story to say it's because it's so normal to be disparaged in such a horrible way. People and children oftentimes I don't think are calling that or defining that bullying. And so kind of to your point of, well, kids will be kids and, they're saying things, they're roughhousing each other on the playground, they're saying weird things to one another. It's more that the parents are sort of hearing it and saying, wait a second, that's not okay. It's not okay for my kid to hear that. We had an intern at Karamah, my cousin, who was very casually last summer telling me, oh yeah, I've been called a terrorist in school. And I said, oh really? And I said, did that make you upset? And he said, oh no, it's like, I'm Muslim, everyone calls everyone a terrorist, like who are Muslim. And it's a very, so I think that there is a bit of, and I know your question was about data collection, I think that there's a reporting issue. There's also a reporting issue of whether children have the right tools to use that language, that this is bullying, I'm feeling harassed, enough to report it to a school administrator or to even your parents.
So I think maybe that circles back to the point that Brenda was making, that I at least initially started this conversation talking about student-on-student bullying, and something that I think Brenda raised, that's an important point, that we also have school administrators that are perpetuating and feeding into that same anti-Muslim rhetoric. And let's rewind. Yes, please.
Actually, though, I do want to jump in because we have a very specific definition, as I said, in the city, and actually one of the parts of the definition, which is the part that throws everybody, is it does have to cause harm. And I want to just caution our notes, because I honestly don't want any child to be called a terrorist for any reason. But we have learned that the effect of bullying on kids is really the important issue. And some kids really are affected differently, and we've learned this with other populations the same way. And kids will walk into a room and be called names, and they don't think anything of the other kids, and they don't care. And they move through their life just fine, and their resiliency is built, and they have a very good self-definition, and they feel a part of the community. There are other kids who don't tell us also when they're being targeted, and it completely undermines their sense of self, their sense of safety, and their ability to actually learn in that classroom. But trying to figure out, just because kids are hearing it, and we've learned this with our kids with disabilities and our gay kids, to be perfectly honest, how it bullying itself is about the psychological harm. So I think it is a really important question. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be sensitive and they shouldn't call it out, and that we should in any way normalize that language, but how we address it is a little bit more complicated.
Perhaps that is part of the challenge. I actually do a personal reflection growing up in Boston when mandatory busing was first implemented. Trigger warning here, and every day I was called a nigger. So did I become used to that language? Yes, but did it have an impact on me? We're not even aware of the impact it has, I think, sometimes as a child. Here I am 40-something years later, and realizing it did have an impact on me. So I'm wondering if, because it's become so much the norm to call Muslim students terrorists, that we say, what's the big deal? He was just called a terrorist. So it would be great. Maybe we can rewind and look at the legal standard. It would be great if are we looking at the subjective standard, the reasonable person standard? Can we rewind for a minute? Jonathan, I know your office does a lot. I don't know if this is a Section 1983 claim or, but what are some of the,
Sure.
What are we seeing in the courts as far as what courts are requiring? We have this great statute within D.C., but on a national level, we're probably ahead of the curve, thanks to Suzanne's office and what you're doing.
Right. So, I mean, I think that just on the question of studies, in preparing for tonight, I spent a little time noodling around on the internet, and there actually are a fair number of people who have looked at this question in terms of how many kids have experienced some form of discrimination. And under the law, the question is not, there is no national prohibition on bullying. There's no statute that says you can't bully. It says you can't discriminate. And it's how do we interpret this kind of conduct inside the anti-discrimination statutes. CARE in California did a study of they've interviewed 600 kids, and Muslim kids, and 55% had been subject to some form of discrimination by other students, and 20% by teachers. So it's very prevalent in teachers, as as was just noted. really set the tone, and the kids do follow the tone of the institutions in which they live in, and so to some extent, and the tone of their home and the national media and all these other characteristics. So to some extent, the fact that you have such a high percentage of teachers engaged in discriminatory conduct is reflective of what's going on inside those schools. So there, as I said, there is no national statute that prohibits something called bullying. There are a number of laws that provide that students who go to school have to be free from discriminatory conduct. So the school itself can't engage in conduct that's discriminatory through its teachers or its educational program or what have you. So what is said and done in the classroom by the teacher is critical to whether you create a climate where each student doesn't have equal access to an education. And if you are bullied and you can't get the benefits of the education in the way that a student who wasn't subjected to that kind of harassment could get a benefit of the education, that's discrimination that's prohibited by federal law. Equally so, the school is responsible to make sure that there's a climate in that school that they're not deliberately indifferent to the conduct of other students to that student, and to prevent that conduct from interfering with that student's ability to get an education on equal terms with everyone else. And that's the extent to which the law provides the kind of protection. There are private litigation that you can bring, but some of the most potent work is being done both by the Department of Justice and the Department of Education, and there are a range of statutes that they apply. The Department of Education, as it turns out, has no statutory authority to look at discrimination based on religion. There's, under the federal law, there's an enormous hole that prevents that goes to race, national origin, gender, color, but doesn't protect against religious speech or religious discriminatory speech. But the Department of Education has promulgated regulations and has offered guidance that when the discrimination based on religion is such that it goes to actual perceived shared ancestry or ethnicity, that it's prohibited discrimination under the federal statutes. The Department of Justice does have, under both Title VI and Title IX and Title IV jurisdiction, the ability. Title IV desegregated the schools, prevents discrimination based on religion. Title VI prevents discrimination based on national origin in any federally funded program, which is every school in this country, and Title IX requires a free and equal education for everyone. The Department of Justice can get directly at religious-based discrimination. The problem is that it's a very tricky kind of area under the law, because you have to balance, and you have to first get to this more complicated question we were discussing, which is, what is the impact on the child? What constitutes discrimination? When does it cross the line between a discourse on a public policy question to become discrimination that prevents child on equal terms being able to get an education? And how do you balance the First Amendment and other rights of the students who are engaged in expressive conduct? And so the courts have been very delicate around this issue. Particularly, they've been reluctant to deal with cyberbullying, which has become an increasing problem. The courts have provided very little guidance there, and what guidance they've provided is they give wide latitude to speakers on social media, less so in the school building, in the school house, but they have left some room for there to be negative, hurtful kinds of comments that don't go as far as those kinds of comments that would prevent children to get an education on equal terms.
So what are we seeing? I should mention, those of you who may not know, I'm my former colleague here, who I just think he's done some great social justice work, was with the Department of Justice, and under his direction, DOJ authored the Ferguson Report, and I actually snubbed my nose at it because it was coming from the Department of Justice until I read it, and it was one of the most balanced, insightful. You could hear Jonathan's advocacy coming out in that report. So if you haven't read it, you should do it. But I made me think about that, because I'm just wondering, what are we seeing that's actually working? So these are the standards. It seems like we're like climbing this mountain. Do we know of what strategies have been most effective when we're looking at protecting children in schools?
I mean, I think these folks may know better than I do. I do know that the courts there's been a number of consent decrees.
It's deliberate indifference.
It's deliberate indifference. And what the court remedies, if you look at the injunctions that have been entered, are not very effective. They are have a policy, collect some data, whatever. And it doesn't provide the kind of leadership inside the schools to make the behavior unacceptable, which is what.
So if I'm correct, when we're looking at deliberate indifference, there has to first be this great policy. Is that correct? That there has to be a policy in place, and the school district is demonstrating deliberate indifference to the policy. Brenda, were you going to?
Yeah, I was just going to add something. So one thing that we did at Muslim Advocates, in part because we had so many parents out of this fear for what can I do, we drafted a letter to every single state superintendent, or whatever their title would be, varying states, that's responsible for education in their state. And in that letter, we highlighted, similar to what you just went through, the legal obligations as a public school district in that state, and what under Title VI and prohibiting discrimination, as well as potential liability there in Section 1983 as well. And what we've done is we attached to that, which a fantastic letter that went out the last day before former Secretary Arne Duncan left and before incoming Secretary King started. On December 31st, the letter went out, a Dear Colleague letter that highlights not just the obligation school district for what they should do, but also highlighted some potential strategies for how to talk about these issues in school, and highlighting the climate for that. And after we sent that letter out, we got so many wonderful emails back from state superintendents saying, thank you, we're not aware if this is happening at the schools, but we're going to look into it, or we're going to have these conversations with our school districts. And we've also asked parents to take that letter and share it with their local school districts as well. So we took kind of the sandwich approach. We'll send it to your state superintendent, you take it to your local school district, because those resources from the Department of Education particularly in that Dear Colleague letter, were quite wonderful.
Great. So, Aisha, I know Karamah had been doing some work on providing supports for students. So if we're looking at what's working, it seems like we have a room full of lawyers and the courts aren't working, ironically. We have an advocacy letter that goes out, and we're at least getting some response from schools being responsive to the needs of students who are bullied. What about trainings, workshops, working with students, identifying some of the ways that we can actually, changing behaviors and providing supports?
Yeah. So I think that one of the things that is really important is having kind of these know your rights type workshops and trainings for parents. And some for children. It's interesting, I did one with children and parents together for Karamah at a local mosque, and it was really interesting because I think the parents were horrified by what their children were sharing in this kind of a forum, because I think, so there's a couple of layers of problems here. One layer is that I think that there's not a lot of communication happening between parents and children particularly about cyberbullying. I think a lot of parents are not aware of all of the social media platforms that their children are on. I think they kind of want to turn a blind eye, perhaps, to what's being shared because I'm making generalizations right now, but I think that that's what I kind of gathered. And then I think when the young people started sharing some of the things that they were sharing with one another and how they were talking with one another, I think the parents were sort of just surprised that was even happening. So that's one layer. And then I think that the next layer is just not knowing the laws or the standard and how to even approach an issue. So a lot of the calls that we're getting, as I referenced before, from parents is really how do I go about reporting an issue? So should I go to the school principal? Should I go to their teacher? Should I put my child in counseling? What are the kind of mechanisms for relief? And I do think that the courts right now are still flying blind. I think that we're still trying to figure out what the right mechanism for relief is. Many years ago when I was practicing in Tennessee, there was a case, it was an interesting sort of remedy. Two girls, a girl had filed a protective order against another girl for for harassment and for actually we kind of got it under stalking, which I thought was really not so creative, but it's not a good long-term, in the end I thought it was not a good long-term solution, but in Tennessee the statute was that as long as there were 3 or more incidents of stalking-like behavior, you could file a protective order against somebody else with whom you did not have a relationship, because that's really the key in protective order. That's the standard in protective order cases. And I remember even then, and this was several years ago, the judge was sort of scratching his head thinking, I don't know how I feel about a child getting a protective order against another child, and how would that work in the school setting? So do they just not stay in the same classroom? Do they stay 50 feet apart from one another? How is that going to be regulated? I mean, what are the regulatory mechanisms of this happening at the school? And frankly, I'm not in favor of more police officers being in schools and whatnot. So it was just a very complicated question. So I think that certainly having, so the know your rights thing is a little bit of a catch-22, because you have to know what you're going to be pitching to parents of what you should be doing. And without guidance from the courts, it's a little bit difficult. But I do think even just starting dialogue, starting conversations between parents and lawyers about feeling like you're not totally without any mechanism of relief, I think is very important.
So I think there are 2 challenges. One, for parents to know the remedies that they have for their students, but then once they determine that remedy, finding an advocate who will help you navigate the often very complicated legal system. Suzanne, I know your office has some kind of, I'm not fully familiar with, but I thought the DC Office of Human Rights had some kind of complaint process.
Yes,
could you share that with us?
We do. I just want to echo something that Aisha said, because it may have been your instinct, but you're absolutely right, where the kids don't share. And a big problem around the issue of bullying is that our kids don't tell us exactly what's going on, but there's a really good reason why they don't tell us, and that's because we usually overreact and we make it worse as far as they're concerned. And this is sort of that double-edged part of this that we work in, especially as our kids get older. They don't tell their parents because their parents overreact. And they feel like that's going to make it that much harder for them in school of how to navigate it and how to deal with this kind of stuff. So we've sort of taken the frame, and I will get to your question because we do have a process, certainly in the Office of Human Rights, but part of the work of the bullying prevention program, which is the program that I run, is that prevention mode. And getting parents in the door to schools before an incident happens to talk about how do we actually illustrate an inclusive community. How do we illustrate that here is a place where everybody is recognized, seen, and validated? And some of that work, and we need parents to do it, because I have to be honest with you, schools don't always want to do it without a little bit of pressure. And that piece of it is super important. On the other hand, certainly through my office and my law very specifically, there is a claim through a hostile educational environment based on a particular trait that you can use to address bullying in a public educational institution. We have a dual process because we want to make sure that you actually get to me first, and we try to resolve the issue for the child, because sometimes the court process, no offense to all the lawyers in here, is not one, takes a long time, and I can't afford to have a kid stay in that kind of environment for any length of time. So we try to work immediately with the school to shift those dynamics, provide the support to the kid so that they feel, the most important piece is making that kid feel safe and protected again, and understand that the adults actually can do something and can do something helpful. So that's the part that we really want to work on first, and then we'd really appreciate it if the legal folks come behind us to actually ensure that it doesn't happen over and over again in the same school.
Yeah, I think that, and the Dear Colleague letter, I think, is very helpful in terms of sort of taking on this issue, because it recognizes the balancing question of people wanting to have a public debate against the need to protect students. But I also think that as we think about this from the legal perspective, that there's often not an understanding of what it is that one understands whether it's bullying and what deliberate indifference actually looks like in the context of a school. And if you've got a lot of students that are saying things that are hostile and harmful, that is probably, that may or may not be enough, and we need to look at those things like, do Muslim kids spend more time getting through the screening of the school resource officer? What are the, when they go to school each day, do teachers talk about, the greatness of America in a way that, what are the permissions that are being given to students by, subtly and not so subtly by the school itself? And so, do they do things like the Dear Colleague letter says that, it's important that people have a respectful mechanism to express these things, if people, and how do they do that? Or does the school just sort of shut people down so that there isn't an outlet for people to actually understand each other? And so I think in terms of thinking about how I would build a legal case, just knowing what one student said to another, how frequently that happened, itself would probably not be enough. I suspect the more you dug, the more you would find this is school-promoted kind of conduct. This isn't happening in isolation because the school administration sets that climate.
I have one quick thought on that, and this is sort of related in a circuitous way, but I'm thinking a lot about this issue of access to an education, which I think is just a basic right for children, and this idea of safe from discrimination. And it's interesting because one of the pieces of advocacy that Karamah is working on currently is the teaching of Islam in public schools. And so there's actually quite a large movement. It's now becoming a national movement. It was starting in Tennessee and Texas and Colorado of just a erasure of Islam from the curriculum and from textbooks. And so there was actually, and I don't want to get into the politics of it, but there were a lot of politicians who were saying that we were indoctrinating children in Islam by even teaching. So, for example, if you're teaching the basics of theology, saying that Muslims believe in 5 pillars, the first pillar is faith in God, and there is an Arabic saying that goes along with that. It just so happens that that's the saying that people say when they convert to Islam as well. That's what they're saying, and so there's this idea that, oh my gosh, Muslims are designing these curricula to convert like all of these children in public schools. It is kind of funny. It's really awful because I think that, but what this is doing is that it's really vilifying and othering Islam and erasing Islam and sort of Islamic history as if it had no significance in the context of our world, and saying that we should be, taking it out of textbooks altogether. And it's interesting because while we have definitely made some inroads with the Department of Education, they're saying that's really up to the schools, individual schools. And so there's a jurisdiction question here of what guidance can the federal government give to local schools on how to control the curriculum. But I think this is one of the subtle ways that you're talking about that's sort of infiltrating the overall discourse in the schools, that there's something wrong with Islam. There should be this, we shouldn't be talking about Islam, which is also impacting how kids are feeling in schools.
Right, if all you hear is the Crusades and 9/11.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the only historical fact you need to be aware of.
I was just going to add one more point because I think it's actually really important, Aisha, that you mention the overall climate for students. And one thing that I always try to remind folks is that when we talk about anti-Muslim hate crimes, what we have seen in the past year, just to give it a date, since the attacks in Paris, we started mapping on a map hate crimes all across the country. And at one point, we had over 50% of those attacks were against houses of worship. And what I try to remind folks is that this is where students, young children go on their weekends for, Quran lessons. This is where they go to have potlucks with their family and family friends. This is where they go for spiritual enlightenment. This is where they go for prayer. This is their safe space that they go to. And after the Paris attacks, we had mosques smeared in feces. We had mosques that were firebombed. We, most recently, we've seen in the past 2 weeks, 2 different attacks that were thwarted against Islamic centers where they were militia-type attacks with 16 weapons and thousands of bullets being found in someone's home, that they were planning a Columbine-type attack against a house of worship. So when we talk about the overall environment and the climate, we have to also keep in mind that when their community centers are attacked, how that makes them feel, even if they go to school, maybe their classmates aren't saying something to them, but they're already feeling otherized. They're already feeling like something's wrong and something's different. Why would my house of worship be attacked? Why is Saturday school canceled, Mama? Oh, it's canceled because somebody was going to shoot it. We have to keep in mind the very real environment that it's been created for children.
Brenda, can you share some of the strategies that you embedded in the Dear Colleague letter? Suggestions that you had?
So the Dear Colleague letter actually came from the 2 secretaries, from Arnie Duncan and John King.
I'm sorry, not the Dear Colleague, the letter that you sent.
The letter that we sent. Yeah. So what our approach to the letter was to describe the environment for students. So we highlighted a number of examples, both of peer-to-peer bullying as well as instances where administrators or teachers, there was a teacher in Texas that created a what you need to know about Muslims and included facts that said things like 38% of Muslims think you should be executed if you decide you don't want to be Muslim anymore. So we tried to highlight these multifaceted, complex issues. We also talked about hate crimes as well, and then, being true lawyers, we subtly put in there, and by the way, your obligation under Title VI and Section 1983 is to ensure a safe and healthy environment for students to learn in, and then we attach the resources. So that was the approach that we took, is to say, hey, administrators, this is a real climate that's across the country. We had considered sending it to individual states with, instances of bullying in each state, but then we were like, this is really a national problem. Regardless of whether or not something's happened in the state or not, this is an overall national climate.
I do think one of the strategies sometimes is to, when you mention the facts, just by a show of hands, a third of this is your pop question for the day, a third of the Muslim in this country are what ethnicity?
African Americans.
South Asian.
South Asian? What do you say? African American. A third of the Muslims in this country are African American. It's estimated that 10% of the Africans that migrated to this country were Africans as well. African Muslims that came to this country through one of the most horrific Holocausts of slavery. So 10% of the Africans who came to this country are Muslim. A third of the Muslims who live in this country today are African Americans. It's a narrative that we never hear because, again, going back to the facts about Muslims, we want to make sure that everyone has this perception of Muslim otherness, of being foreign terrorists who are coming to this country to do nothing but bad to us. So I do think that fact statement becomes critical, going back to how do we create cultures within schools that are inclusive. Yeah. So what about, I do want to return to social media, because within the legal context, it does create a very different legal framework when we talk about trying to regulate private speech in that social network. Has anyone been working in this area of social media and bullying? Suzanne, you're smiling.
I'm smiling because it's a constant. I mean, we know our law covers bullying, whether it's a physical, if it's social emotional, it's verbal, or it's happening electronically. So
wow.
we certainly
you
cover
get
it.
Surprised.
Yeah, the difference between having a great policy and actually making sure it's implemented is a very long road, I have to tell you. But we have it in paper, and that's a start. So I do my hats off to the people that wrote it. They really thought about a lot of things. The social media piece is interesting again, and I just want to say it does work somewhat differently with youth than it does with adults. So we again see that most kids who are targeted on social media are also targeted in real life. It's very rarely disconnected. So what that means is that it's not that the social media is the problem, it's that it's now a 24/7 clock that they're under. They don't get away from it. Old-fashioned bullying you got away from when you left school. They're sort of under that feeling at any time. But a lot of social media, actually the responsibility of how kids use social media, their access to social media, goes back to parents. As I have to remind parents, I do a lot of parent talks, the schools did not give your kids those phones. They don't issue those. We do. I as a parent, I gave my kids their first phones. How we talk to kids about how to use them, how to stay safe with them, what they should be used for, is really part and parcel. We have to work with our schools on this stuff, but it's really a much more complicated conversation. Right now, all we have is sort of the input of, we know when something goes really wrong, and social media has a piece to it. We're trying to figure out how to punish that piece. And that's really all we've been able to accomplish so far on that. But I think we really need to step back and think about it in a much larger context, because social media is, as you mentioned, I can't keep up on what app or what my kids are doing. My kids are now in college. I'm not even going to try. But I know that it's an extension of who they are, and part of their personality is now in their social media profile, and I can't stop that. And so I need to figure out how to help them be good digital citizens. I need to help them understand the consequences of behavior. I need to help them understand how to stay safe themselves. There's a lot of things that they need to be thinking about, because we're not going to stop social media from happening.
One thing that I'll add there, and this is something that we did a few years ago, not related to bullying, but we did a report called Click Here to End Hate. And it was an effort for, we do a lot of work with social media companies. Muslim Advocates is based in San Francisco in the Bay Area. And, what that report highlights is, what you do if you feel that, there's hate speech, how to report it, and how, what to do and where to click, and how long should you wait for a response. And there have been several instances where in the past year alone where there was a picture of a woman wearing hijab that was in a Walmart parking lot. Somebody took that picture and wrote some really racist comments about her, and it was flying around, turned into like a meme of this woman, wearing hijab, and, she had no idea. Somebody pointed out to her, like, hey, isn't that you? And somebody had taken that photo of her. And, with our relationships with the social media companies, we were able to, not just click here and report this to have it taken down, but, we went straight to the social media companies and got taken it down right away. So there's also, ways to combat that once it's out there, and that's something that we try to do, because sometimes it's not fast enough. I mean, we see how quickly these things just spread like wildfire, and hundreds of thousands of shares quite quickly. So that is something that we have been trying to navigate that space as well.
Is that a tool that you would recommend for parents? Is that something that parents could easily?
Yeah. So the report, so it's not, and I can certainly share the report with you. It's not something that's specific to bullying or specific to anything in particular, but there are these variety of categories, and I'm embarrassed to say that I only really know how to use Facebook, and then I know there's so many others out there, but when you click on the drop down, like, I don't like this post because, and then there's different categories for it, and we've been really working for to try to get those categories, particularly when it's hate speech or something that's it's my picture and I didn't ask for it to be up, or whatever it may be, to try to get them to take swift action on those.
So I think that the unfortunate reality is that a lot of this is emerging as an issue. So, a couple of weeks ago, we were just talking about this, to Brenda's point, right before the panel, that there was a young boy who was beaten up, who was bullied and had quite really, sort of physical harm done to him. It wasn't just verbal bullying. And I feel like with that story going viral, with other stories like it going viral, a lot of studies, so, to the point of, are there studies, is there data? I think that there's a lot more studies that are being done now of the PTSD, of the, what is the psychological impact, to your point of seeing these images, seeing the stories on social media, and how that's impacting. And so I think that Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms are coming out and trying to be, sort of cool and saying, hey, we're seeing that this is a problem. But it's sad that it's happening after, these sort of horrible acts have occurred. And I think that it also begs a larger question, and I'm definitely not going to feel this. I'm going to toss it to my right. This issue of sort of free speech and chilling free speech, because I think in the bullying context, it may be a little bit easier for people to understand, because children are children and there's different standards, whereas we're seeing a spike in hate speech amongst adults, which is also leading to hate crimes. So just to reference for you guys, there is a Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism out of the California State University, and they just issued a study a couple of days ago on, they did a recent 20-state study of hate crimes. And I won't, it's a little bit political, but after a very widely known political candidate tweeted something at 1:47 p.m. on December 2nd after the San Bernardino attacks, they saw that there was an 87.5% increase in hate crimes against Muslims in a 5-day period, which this attorney, his name is Robert Levin, is citing, let me just make sure I got it, Brian Levin, excuse me, is citing that he believes that there is a direct correlation between that tweet going viral and kind of the impact on hate crimes. But he also says that, again, this is an emerging issue. The university is going to be doing a lot more detailed study on what that nexus is. But I think, we're talking about bullying, but then we're talking about chilling free speech in social media. I mean, I think it's a really complicated legal question.
Did you want to add anything?
You want me to try to handle that?
Yeah.
So there are, I think, two bodies of law to think about in that context, and at least that the courts have recognized. One is libel and slander. If you say something untrue about somebody and it harms them, you can be sued and they can recover damages for that. And if they're a public figure, the standard is much higher and it's more complicated to succeed in securing damages. And that's an available remedy. It's a pretty unsatisfying one, candidly, because you can, the court won't restrain the speech prior to it being made. The court will give you money afterwards and after litigation and a long process and what have you. The second, in which we were talking about earlier, is to what extent can you criminalize the kind of speech that causes harm? And the courts have been extremely reluctant to, because of the First Amendment, because of the sort of difficulty of trying to wade into the area of trying to understand when someone's speech has a damaging effect in a non-libelous kind of way on the hearer of that speech. And the court is really focused in on those when one speaks, that one does it in a way that creates a threat, so that you're not permitted to threaten to harm someone else. You place them, that the court is, the laws have recognized that there's an injury that occurs to you just by being fearful that someone is going to hurt you. And so if you, and it's called truth, the true threat doctrine, if somebody says something online or to you in person or writes you a letter, and a reasonable person reading that would believe that that person's going to carry out that threat in some way or another, and you subjectively believe that that person may carry out that threat, then that can be criminalized, and it's also subject to liability in civil proceedings. Now, we were talking earlier, I litigated this, or was I personally didn't litigate it, with the team of folks that I was working with litigated this issue in a slightly different context. We were represented a doctor who provided abortion services in Topeka, Kansas, and she, one of the anti-abortion activists, had sent her a letter that says, you should just be careful going forward because, you should look under your car every day because there may be a bomb placed. She never said, I'm going to put a bomb under your car, but she says, you should be careful and look under your car every day because there may be a bomb, and you should, and you should pray for your redemption and what have you, because you never know what's going to happen. And the court originally threw out the case and said that's not a true threat. She was just stating facts. You should look under your car every day because there might be, and her defense was, I was being a very good Christian woman because I was warning her that there may be some risk to her. Well, the woman who made the wrote the letter to the doctor, also was good friends with Scott Roeder. People remember Scott Roeder. He's serving life for murdering an abortion doctor in Topeka, Kansas. She visits him every week in prison. And the doctor knew this. And so the Court of Appeals, we took it to the Circuit Court of Appeals, the Court of Appeals said, under those circumstances, any reasonable person could see that there may be a basis for which that would be fearful that the threat would be carried out. Whether she intended it carried out or not is irrelevant. Whether or not a reasonable person reading that letter, knowing those circumstances, it may be carried out. And the doctor had a subjective belief that it could be carried out. And that was a true threat. And so in these circumstances where somebody is encouraging violence in a way in which a reasonably objective person would say that the violence may be carried out, and the receiver of that subjectively has the experience that they worry that violence will be carried out against them, then that is a true threat under the law. The courts don't extend that to this sort of horrible, vile craziness that people say, racist craziness people say, but in circumstances where there is a specific target and a specific sort of threat, it doesn't have to say, I am going to do this to you. It just has to be a reasonably objective basis for doing that. And that's where the courts have bumped up against the First Amendment, and that's where they've sort of drawn that analysis.
I want to shift a little bit. I think we've been spending some time talking about protections for students whom are being bullied, having represented students who were alleged to be bullying, and school systems suspending them and attempting to expel them. How should we be balancing this? Again, we keep talking about children. I think we kind of forget that part of the equation. Suzanne?
I will jump in here because the old-fashioned method of addressing bullying in schools was you find the bully and you punish the bully. And punishment usually meant suspension and pushing kids out the door. And I will tell you that has been not only a remarkably ineffective strategy for addressing bullying, it has probably done a tremendous amount to increase the school-to-prison pipeline. So we really have pushed back very hard in the work that we're doing in the city to actually not be in the discipline frame, but be in a public health frame. And we know from the research that really what makes a difference for kids is that you change the behavior of the kid who's being aggressive. And kids are usually being aggressive for an unmet need. There's an underlying reason that they're behaving that way. It could be, honest to God, many, many different underlying reasons why they're behaving that way. One could be they're watching too much, political coverage and they're hearing the words and they're just mimicking them. There could also be a lot of other more serious reasons why they're acting that way. So we're really pushing back and saying, with the kid who's being the aggressor, let's find out what's going on and let's change this behavior. That's really working around developmentally that looks different when we've got little kids versus middle school kids versus high school kids. But I will tell you, empathy building is probably important all the way along the spectrum. And when you're dealing with a kid who's being aggressive. The flip side of that is that we also know now from the research that we have done a tremendously bad job in addressing kids who've been targeted. And they actually have the repercussions, whether they know it, and I don't disagree with you that it can have harm even if you're not categorizing it as harm. But we've done very little to reattach our kids' sense of safety and belonging in that school building or wherever it is, so that they start thinking that it's about them. And they start seeing themselves as the person that will always be ostracized or the person that won't belong. And until we break that cycle, they're actually at much higher risk for all kinds of dangerous behaviors going forward. So that's where our energy really should be, in changing behavior, because we are talking about kids, and I do not believe in criminalizing behavior of kids. I really do think we need to think in a developmental framework when we're talking about that. It is their job to push boundaries. It is their job to try to figure out where they belong and who their peer groups are and what these things mean. We need to model appropriate behavior. We need to teach them, not just tell them what to do. But we also really need to be spending a whole lot more time around our kids who are being targeted, because we've actually left them out of the equation in all those suspensions we did.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that we have adequate time for questions. So I'd like to take this moment to open the floor for questions, if anyone has any questions. Yes, if you could stand for us, please.
Hi, it's Brenda.
Get out.
So, thank you all very much. Everything this was really helpful. And as a mom of young Muslim children, and as a lawyer, it's great for me to know about the remedies and what I can do. But ultimately, my goal is preventing harm, not going to court, right? to seek a remedy. So I was just wondering, and for me, with the current political climate, part of me is just this is our new normal, and I have to internalize that, because no matter who wins the election, this climate's not going to change overnight. So what are the strategies you guys discuss with parents to make sure my kids are confident and strong, so that I can't ignore this going to happen, because it likely will. I'm lucky I'm in a public charter school that's very diverse, and so maybe not. But what are the things that you guys are working with parents on the ground to say, okay, I'm going to make sure my kids are really strong, and if this does happen, it kind of rolls off their back.
I will just quickly say, we learned a lot back in the day from the gay rights movement, to be perfectly honest. Right after Prop 8 happened, the level of aggression against our LGBT kids was really strong in California and across the country. And I think that some of the strategies were to really go out there actually and use social media on the other side. And, everything from the It Gets Better campaign to the, really actually taking the bull by the horns and saying, no, that's actually not our reality, and we're going to create our own reality, and our reality is going to look very different. And we really do want to, I think we have to think about those things, because as a parent, I don't want our kids to inherit this mess we've, presently have here. And I think that there's a lot of connection that it can actually happen through social media. And we saw this again, rural kids who are very, very isolated from larger communities can come together on the internet in a way that they didn't have in real life, certainly for LGBT youth. So I think some of those places where we actually flipped the script on people and raised up in a very powerful way can actually be some of the things that we could start thinking about right away to be doing.
So I would add, and I appreciate your question on so many levels, because I do this work day in and day out, and then I have twin 7-year-olds that I worry about every day, and so it's the irony is certainly there. But one thing I'll say is that I certainly think that we can't assume that the school is aware of the fear that you have about your child, and so that's in part why we encourage parents to take our letter and share it with their principal or their vice principal or with the teacher themselves, right? To let them know that these are things that I'm concerned about. My kids, they're in 2nd grade, they come home and talk about the election all the time. They have these conversations on the playground, who they're going to vote for. And I tell them, you're 7, you can't vote just yet. But it for me, it's allowed me the opportunity to have healthy conversations with my children. People can choose. We're in a democracy. Just like, you get to vote what we want for, where we're going to go for dinner. You have a turn, whatever it may be. But it gives me the opportunity as a parent to have these conversations with my children. But in part because of the climate, it wasn't until I went in and spoke to the teacher and the principal, even though they don't have a problem, they haven't been bullied or anything, but just letting them know that this is something that I, as a parent at the school, am concerned about, and I just want you to be aware that this is, the climate, and most of them already know, but depending on where you live, and that I have a child in this school that I want to make sure that you're aware of these, the environment and some of the different ways it may manifest itself. Now, on the flip side, there are some other organizations that are doing really great work in terms of improving cultural competencies in schools, making sure that teachers and administrators have this greater cultural competency and are aware of, what does it mean to be Muslim? What are these statistics? Muslims are not all immigrant communities. They are diverse, and, there are, the statistics range between 3 and 6 million. You may have one in your school. They may not have a name like Muhammad Abdelall, they may have a name like Brenda or whatever it may be, right? So it's something that is a really great effort, and there are ways to try to bring those kinds of conversations to schools. And then one last thing I'll add is I met this amazing 16-year-old who has started a program at her high school in Montgomery County. It was called Seek Kid to Kid. And what she's done is she has because of the confusion and people didn't understand the differences between Sikhs and Muslims, and they started an organization at their school where the kids talk to their teachers about what does it mean to be Sikh, how is that different from Hindu, how is that different from being Muslim, and they created a whole program around it, and then they go talk to other students and student groups, and so it also, as your children get older, there are opportunities for them to own their own narrative, right? And we raise them while they're young to be proud of who they are, and then you see that, seeing this 16-year-old girl start this organization to increase cultural competency. Yeah, I'm sure you've met her too. So, it was quite inspiring, and I hope, and maybe there are similar efforts by young Muslim students in public schools as well, but I wanted to share that there's things that you can do as a parent. There's resources that can come to your school for teachers and administrators, and then encouraging our high school kids to shape their own narratives as well.
Really quickly, I want to answer the question in a very different way, which is, I think that, so Karamah is an educational organization, and we work with different marginalized groups within the Muslim community, mostly women. A lot of our work is on gender equity, which is, it's a little bit of a different, bullying is one issue of marginalization and patriarchy is another. And I think one of the incredible tools of empowering Muslim women is through knowledge of Islam. And I think what is really the root of what's happening is that Islam is being vilified. Islam is being torn down. And I think as proud Muslims who are proud of their faith, I feel like we have to counter the narrative for our children at home so that, these voices are so loud. But I think that there can be much more emphasis placed on creating a strong identity, which is not only in just religious teaching of doctrine, of practice and rituals, which is all very important, but also, for example, civic engagement. It's the time for voting right now. I find it incredibly powerful as a Muslim woman that the first group that ever voted in Islamic history was a group of women. That's a story that our children should be hearing. And I think that idea of democracy and civic engagement from a religious perspective should also be a part of our kitchen table conversations in Muslim families, so that we're countering some of we're not going to be able to stop what kids are hearing on the news. We're not going to be able to stop what they're getting in social media. And so I think that this idea of really teaching Islam in its just and equitable, sort of scholarship that's been done, and you can check out Karamah's website. I think it's, and not shameless plugs all throughout this, but I think it's really, I personally have found that that's been so transformative in the gender context for people who are like, well, we didn't even know that we had these rights. What we don't want to do is create a generation of kids who are saying, I'm not out as a Muslim because I'm so embarrassed of being Muslim, or I'm scared of being Muslim. Instead, we want to give tools, primarily, and putting more work on your plate, but for parents to be teaching kids about the legacy of Islam and what to be proud of.
Yes. Question, could you stand, please? Thank you.
Hi. Salam, everyone. Thanks all of you for coming and helping us learn more. So I'm a government paralegal. I've worked with attorneys for 9 years. And one thing that attorneys tend to work with, and some of them really love, is hypotheticals. So for all the panelists, I want to give you guys 2 hypotheticals that are similar but related. And I'd love for the panelists to sort of react to it. How about that? So I want you guys to imagine any public school, and I want you to imagine 3 students. Khadija, a young Muslim woman, any age. Ali, a young Muslim male, any age. Think of any sort of background, immigrant, American-born, whatever. And then think about Bill, a non-Muslim student in the same context. I was really moved by you guys' comments about whether or not kids have internalized and absorbed Muslims are terrorists, so it's okay for me to be called a terrorist. I want you guys to think about Khadija being called that and being really emotionally affected by it. And I want you to think about Ali being called that in school, whether by peer or by a superior, and Ali just being like, yeah, whatever, just like your cousin was. It's no big deal. Yeah, everyone calls Muslim terrorists these days. And I want you to think about Bill, who's sort of not Muslim, not understanding the same background, and just sort of feeling like, why is Khadijah so upset? I don't really get it. And with this hypothetical, I'd love to hear you guys sort of think about and talk about, what happens in our community where you have these two Muslim kids and they're interacting with each other in the schools or in the Muslim community outside the school, and one kid thinks it's no big deal and another kid is emotionally affected by it. What I'm trying to get at is what you called empathy building, but also emotional intelligence skills, and how this is going to affect Muslim youth. The other hypothetical...
Can we just stick with the one for now?
It's related.
Okay, go ahead.
So I want you to just flash forward 20 years. All three of these kids are 20 years older. They're in the workplace. They've had this situation that I described to you. I'm 20 years older. I'm still in the workforce. And I'd love to hear you guys think about what all of this will do for people my age, people their age, 20 years in the future, as members of the workforce and as employees. So, sorry, it's a lot, but you guys are worried. You guys can handle it.
Suzanne, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit when you referenced...
It's a wonderful hypothetical, and it happens every day. And I've seen it with lots of different subgroups of kids, and one of the great parts about my job is I do focus groups with youth all the time to talk about what's affecting them. I think that it does again default back to Khadijah needs to be told it's unacceptable, and she needs to be validated, and she needs to be assured that the kids aren't allowed to keep saying that. So we really do need to address it. But the bigger context is we also need to pull back. What's going on in the school, and I think Jonathan, you said it best, like that makes it okay that this kind of stuff happens. We need to make it socially unacceptable because there are consequences for how we talk about things. The difference for me is I don't want to criminalize that, and I don't want to assume that I know what the consequences for everything is, because I really do want us to be thinking about we seem to be going in cycles where we'll think about one particular subgroup at a time instead of stepping back and saying, how do we create a place where everybody, whether maybe Bill has some issues, I don't actually know, how do we create a language and a consistency around that where everybody's individuality is actually validated? And that's a much harder piece of the work, but I listened to the same panel, and that young girl is awesome, and I hope we all get to vote for her someday, because she is, everything about her was phenomenal. But the fact of the matter is that she's, again, in that position of recreating the wheel where, this week it's this subgroup, and this week it's that. When do we step back and help ourselves see that I can't predict who it's going to be, but I can promise you there's a very, very small Native American population here in D.C., but that football team really does undermine a lot of kids' sense of, safety and security. I want that addressed at the same time. So that pulling back to me is, how do we really help all three of those kids go forward saying, yeah, that might have happened, but that was not right, and that's not the environment I want to have going forward.
I'm going to jump in and try to deal at least a little bit with both of the last two questions. Is the person, I have the privilege of not having to have that conversation with my kid, but I have a different special obligation because I have that privilege to...
what kind of privilege is that, Jonathan? Say it.
The old white guy privilege?
There you go. One thing I love about him, he acknowledges his white privilege and uses it for good.
Well, I make mistakes just like everybody else. But so, there is an obligation that I then have of modeling the behavior. So that Bill sees somebody who says that's not okay. So Bill understands through the experience of seeing somebody say what happened is not okay. And I'm going to test the pushback on the premise, because I don't think, I don't remember the name of the boy, Ali. I don't think, he may not think he's being harmed by it. He may not even believe he's being harmed. He's being harmed by it.
Right.
And so having some, my obligation then as a parent is that for my daughter to see that I don't stand. It's very easy to be, when people do bad things, it's very easy to be silent about it and not intervene and not try to make a difference, because there's consequences to trying to, some of my privilege I have to give up, and I have to, expend that privilege on things. And for my daughter to see that I do that and build in her to be a human being that will do that as well, I think is a critical piece of change. And it sounds very abstract and everything else, but it is something I think we all have to think about. And I thought about it in the context of the debates, and I know we're not saying the names, but one of the candidates said something really horrible about people saw guns and stuff, and this counterfactual kind of statement. And then the other one said, didn't actually dispute the facts, although she should have, but then went on to say something that was sort of extraordinary, because it was the progressive answer, which was, we need to build relationships into the Muslim community so that we have better intelligence and all that sort of stuff. Well, Dylan Roof walked into an African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina, and shot people, and nobody said, how come the white community didn't stand up and tell us Dylan Roof was going to go do that? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It's not how, it's this sort of sense of an unreality about what a community is and what it means and how people are, and that this difference and this separation and stuff that you're talking about. And so, and it was sort of, I mean, that was sort of, I was watching the debates alone. My wife and daughter refused to watch the debates because they made them crazy. And started yelling at my computer while I was doing it, but realized there was nothing else I could figure out what to do. And that's the stuff that is on me in this room. It's too bad that there aren't more people like me that are sitting here in this room tonight, because that's who we need to be talking to. Right? I mean, I have an obligation, just like Carmichael said, white people should be talking to white people, not black people, about racism. And that's kind of an ethic that is important for us to remember.
I think the only thing I would add to this is sort of a more sort of anecdotal story about my own sister, because she is the Khadija 20 years later. We grew up in a small town outside of Detroit in the 80s. She was on a school trip. This was when there was a spate of, hijackings to airplanes, and they were going to Florida on a plane. And the chaperones joked around, oh, is your uncle gonna, hijack the plane? And this was on their way to their school trip. And, when I look back, my parents' response to that was, we packed up, we moved to Ann Arbor, which is a much more progressive. So I grew up in a bubble. My sister did not. So she spent her first, all the way through 7th grade, growing up in an environment where she was the only Muslim, the only person of color in her entire school, the entire elementary school. And she grew up in a very different environment than I did. And it's funny now when we talk about these things, because, she grew up in an environment where she didn't feel empowered to say something, right? Because she was the only one. She didn't have allies, she didn't have classmates that were there supporting her and helping her sort of get through things. And my experience was very different. I grew up in a bubble where even to this day, and maybe because of social media, my elementary school friends and high school friends are so supportive. And what can I do? I had a friend who teaches now in Guatemala who emailed me asking me, what can I talk to my students about, anti-Muslim bullying in students and what happens in America, right? And I mean, that's kind of like the true power of, just being in completely different circumstances within our own family. And, my sister doesn't have that. Her high school friends are not, maybe one or two of them are still her friends on social media, but, have very different views about Muslims and Islam. And, so I think you're absolutely right in terms of thinking about what happens then and what impacts them 20 years later. And I think if you don't do something earlier on, engaging with, the families, talking with students, creating a culture of inclusivity and appreciation for diversity at a young age, and a culture that fosters empathy, what you end up with is 20 years later, the same people holding those same views. And I think that's really the tragic part of it. So,
I think we have time for one more question. Yes. Could you stand up, please? Thank you.
So my name's Terry Thompson. I am a School of Divinity student at Howard University.
HU, you know.
You know. I'm also a lawyer, so I'm going to say I agree. Lawyers don't have the answers. I like to believe that the faith community has some, but right now I don't think that they know what the tools are. And I'd like to hear some discussion about, from an interfaith perspective, what are some of the things that the faith community can do, kind of from a more general perspective, in helping to eradicate some of this.
I'm going to let the panel answer this, but I definitely want to piggyback on something that Aisha mentioned that I thought was really right on target. This idea of teaching children, and girls in particular, the power and rights embodied in Islam. And I mention that because I reverted to Islam when I was in my late 20s. And part of, I hate to intellectualize, I always hate to intellectualize my religious journey, but part of my attraction was I was amazed as a feminist about the rights that the religion bestowed on women. I mean, women in 1890s were just getting the right to own property in New York, and Islam in 7th century Arabia was giving women the right to own property. So I do think from the faith-based community doing exactly what Aisha mentioned, teaching and perpetuating and instilling the gender equitable principles of Islam, and for other faith-based communities, understanding those commonalities that we often talk about when we do interfaith dialogue and interfaith kind of programs. But let me pass that question on to our panelists.
I was just going to, and I always appreciate the question about interfaith efforts, because that's really one area where I have seen where those interfaith relationships are built before hate crimes happen, to see how communities come together, communities of faith come together, and really for the overall, everything in communities, not just interfaith issues, but, broader sort of social issues within a community that can be resolved through, communities coming together. But one thing I wanted to add is that in recent months, every single time there's been a hate crime against a house of worship, almost always the first people to show up are interfaith partners. A mosque was vandalized last week in New Jersey. Before prayers the next day, interfaith partners were there scrubbing off the hateful rhetoric. And we've seen time and time again where there are armed protests that take place outside of mosques. The first people that are standing there hand in hand to protect young children going to pray, or protect the congregants that are going in to pray, are interfaith partners standing there saying, this is not what our community stands for. And that really shows a true symbol for Muslim communities that, this is not what America stands for. And so in moments where, it's easy to feel, as low as possible when you come to your mosque and you find feces smeared all over it, when you see the community come together, and in large part it's interfaith communities that will come the next day, clean with you and tell you this is not who we are, that's really, it's truly beautiful, and that truly gives hope after such, tragic attacks.
Yeah. So I love this idea, unless someone wanted to add, I love this idea, I know it sounds very kumbaya, but ending on this concept of hope. So if we can end there, and please give our amazing panelists a round of applause. I do have a few announcements that I'd like to make. Those of you who are not familiar with Canva, we invite you to become members. Conveniently, we are here and prepared to take your membership applications. I also want to take a moment to ask, Oshin and Danya, could you stand for a moment? So these are two of the founding members of the Capital Area Muslim Bar Association. We are very fortunate that they had this vision to pull us back together so that we can begin to address the issues that we are seeing that are so prevalent in the Muslim community. So I thank you both for your vision and your work. We have a few upcoming events on November 3rd. We have an election and opportunity to meet some of our amazing board candidates. Please go to our website so you can see all the events we have going on. November 14th, Minority Flight, Why Women of Color Are Leaving Law Firms and How to Turn the Tide, and that's co-sponsored with the Women's Bar Association. We have flyers out front that list some of our other upcoming events. Again, I encourage you to get involved. Courtney Dunn, thank you again for your involvement with the American Bar Association. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you.